With the outbreak of World War II, the Royal Navy had ordered a raft of smaller destroyers under the Emergency Programme, starting with the O-class, which was ordered the day that war was declared, and no less than 14 emergency flotillas had subsequently been ordered. In the course of working their way down the alphabet and back around to the C-class, the overall displacement of these ships had only gone up by around 100 tons, but the sensors and weapons fits had changed radically. The latest emergency destroyers had true dual-purpose main armament, radar, and many other new systems. But with well over 100 of these emergency ships either in service or under construction, the British took a little bit of a breather towards the mid-part of 1942 to consider the next steps in their next-generation destroyer construction. The full fleet destroyer design that would come out of this would be the Battle class. But with these vessels topping 2,300-ton standard displacement, there were a number of slipways which had been happily churning out destroyers up to this point, but were not able to accommodate these new, larger ships. In order to maximise the size of the future fleet, and because after all they were still at war, a smaller design was also to be prepared that incorporated as much of the latest lessons and technology as possible, but would ideally fit into these shorter slipways. This design would become known as the Weapon class. These vessels would be aimed primarily at anti-aircraft warfare and anti-submarine warfare roles, which would allow the larger battles to worry about direct ship-versus-ship combat as their priority task, although obviously both classes had to be capable of all three roles. After several abortive attempts at designing a ship no larger than the seas, but somehow also significantly better, which included such wonderful things as fixed rather than rotating torpedo tubes, it was realised that this approach just wasn't going to work, and so a slightly larger hull was allowed. The two main compromises made were speed and the size of the main battery. After some discussion, the 40,000 shaft horsepower power plant from the emergency programme destroyers was agreed upon. This meant that the ships would only be capable of a fraction over 31 knots as opposed to the originally desired 32.5 knots. The reduction in speed due to the additional weight, as they were now just a fraction under 2,000 tons as opposed to the 1,700 tons or thereabouts of the largest emergency flotilla ships. This power would run through the standard pair of two screws, and for the main battery, whilst the C-class had shown the new standard gun was to be the 4.5-inch, the Weapon class would instead carry 4-inch guns. At first, this was to take the form of 3 twin mountings, a pair superfiring forward and one aft, with other weapons to include a pair of twin 40mm Bofors mounts with integrated radar guidance, and 2 twin Oerlikons which would be reliant on more general overall direction. A pair of quadruple torpedo tubes would give the ships a good anti-capital ship punch, along with some depth charge launchers for anti-sub work. But all of this would then be changed. The torpedo launchers were upgraded to quintuple or pentad in British terminology versions, the twin Oerlikons were replaced with a single Bofors apiece, and finally, as the ships were being built, it was decided to swap out one of the 4-inch mounts for a set of Squid anti-submarine mortars instead of the other anti-submarine equipment. By the time all of this had been worked out, and various ships ordered as part of the 1943 programme, the design had gotten a bit too large for some of the smallest yards, and of the 19 authorised ships, albeit that some sources also add in HMS Lance as a notional 20th vessel, only 13 were actually laid down over the course of 1944 and 45, and of these only 6 actually made it to launch. Battleaxe, Broadsword, Cutlass, Crossbow, Scorpion and Carronade, the others having been cancelled toward the end of 1945. Cutlass and Carronade would also be cancelled at the very end of that year, leaving 4 ships built to a pair of different profiles. Battleaxe and Broadsword had lost their superfiring B-mount for their Squid launchers, whilst Crossbow and Scorpion had lost their rear or X-mount in exchange for the Squid launchers. This left the latter two looking a little bit like the Battle class from a distance, as they had an all-forward gun armament. Part of the improvements had been alternating the machinery spaces, and this meant that there were 2 funnels instead of just 1, but with the ships critically short on open deck space, the forward funnel was then incorporated into the foremast, which by this point was a square lattice type, whilst the aft funnel remained somewhat more visible. The 4 ships would commission in 1947 and 1948, being assigned as fleet anti-submarine warfare escorts for a brief period of service before going into reserve in 1956. They were then brought out of reserve the next year to refit them into radar pickets, which involved standardising the location of the guns, all forward, and the squid launchers, are now all aft, and the torpedo launchers were then removed. In their place, a second mast for accommodating new radar was installed, and the other torpedo launcher was replaced by a built-up accommodation area for the radar operators and their equipment. In this guise, they re-entered service towards the end of the 1950s, but Battle Axe was involved in a collision in 1962 and was deemed to be damaged beyond economic repair. The others would go back into reserve the following year and were kept in reserve before being scrapped in the early 1970s.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.